Welcome to The Week Ahead, a podcast by SBM Intelligence. I'm your host, Veronica Pana Igube. Every Friday, we explore stories shaping our continent, and today we are stepping back to take stock of where Africa stands as we close 2025 and look ahead to 2026. Is Africa a geological rift system being pulled apart by powerful external and internal forces? Or is it a united team stepping onto the Premier League pitch of global politics, ready to compete? The events of 2025 have made this question impossible to ignore. This year delivered major geopolitical shockwaves. The return of an America First posture translated into sharper, more transactional engagement with Africa, aid costs, coercive diplomacy, and even warnings of possible military action against Nigeria. Is this genuine concern or pressure masquerading as principle? West Africa also faced a historic rupture. Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger formally exited ECOWAS, marking a fundamental unraveling of regional cooperation. Since this jihadist violence in the Sahel had surged, spilling into coastal states and reshaping the region's security landscape. Across the continent, flashpoints multiplied, Sudan's civil war ground on, deepening famine and fueling fears of partition. In eastern DRC, M23 rebels captured Goma, threatening not just regional stability, but global cobalt supply chain. And from Kenya to Senegal, Gen Z-led protests erupted, demanding accountability and economic justice for political elites. Climate and economics added another layer of strain. The world crossed the 1.3 degrees warming threshold, and while a $300 billion loss and damage deal emerged at COP30, it felt more like a tranquil applied from a homogeneous had begun. Economically, Africa told a story of contrast. Ghana staged a comeback under an IMF program. Kenya overlooked Ethiopia as East Africa's largest economy overtook, while Nigeria wrestled with a painful paradox, improving microeconomics indicators alongside collapsing human security, exemplified by a booming kidnapping for ransom industry. So what lies ahead in 2026? Politics would politics would dominate the year with major elections in Uganda, Zambia, and South Sudan, and early campaigning already shaping Nigeria and Kenya's road to 2027. Security risks remain bleak and expanding from jihadist consolidation in northwest Nigeria, rebels control in the eastern DRC, and growing uncertainty in Ethiopia's north. Economically, there is certain optimism. Nigeria's growth may reach a 4 to 5%, but inflation will likely remain. The central bank is expected to prioritize naira stability over aggressive rate cuts, while softening oil prices could strain budgets, even as production inches upward. All of this brings us to a reflective point. Will 2026 be Africa's year, where it finds strategic unity, or one where fractioning forces deepens the cracks? In today's episode, we unpack these fault lines, the focus, and what they mean for Africa's place in a rapidly shifting global order. Because as this report reminds us, the referee isn't waiting for us to warm up, but the match is already on. Joining us for this conversation is Nkemesit Effiong, partner at SBM Intelligence, and Samuel Atiku, policy analyst. Welcome, Nkemesit and Samuel, to the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me on the podcast. Yep.
I mean, 2025 has been a year. And, as we go back to review the year, we reflect on things that have happened in Africa, both good and bad. I think I'll start with you in Nkemesit. Looking back at 2025 as a whole, what would you describe Africa as more fractioned or more strategically aware? And what singular if events will I say or structure reform, what best captures that reality?
Okay, I think Africa has become more fractured, right? So 2025 has continued a theme that we've seen in sort of the last 3-4 years. Certainly that was the case in 2024, and also the case in 2023 and a little bit in 2022, where a combination of coups and attempted coups, youth-led protest and reform efforts, as well as external geopolitical actors, whether it's the United States or European actors, or as we're seeing in places like the Horn of Africa and in Sudan, actors in the Near East or the Middle East, whichever one's your preference. All of those factors have come together to ensure that Africa is being pulled in many directions. And I think the two developments that perhaps best encapsulate that reality are, one, the return of Donald Trump to the White House, right? And how he has not necessarily debuted, but supercharged this transactional bilateral form of geopolitical engagement with the world, where he's essentially pursuing a divide and conquer strategy, and he's essentially trying to remake the world, certainly remake the framework of, what it means to be a US ally or to be closely engaged with the United States, or what it means to be on the other side. And so you've had, within the continent, you've had net winners and losers, right, in the Donald Trump column, as it were. So countries like South Africa, for example, are dealing with geopolitical stresses which they haven't contemplated in decades, really dating back to the era of apartheid. South Africa has largely been considered a very pro-Western, aligned player. Certainly on the continent, it's the most industrialized economy. It has probably the most powerful military on the continent, but it also has deep structural issues, especially economically, and especially managing the tension between white South Africans and black South Africans, right? The legacy of apartheid, as it were. And Donald Trump has so entered that conversation and colored it into an us versus them paradigm that he's essentially been punishing South Africa, right? In bilateral and multilateral forums, the US is in the process of renegotiating or reauthorizing AGOA, the Africa Growth and Opportunity Act. And South Africa will likely be left out of that. And that hasn't happened in the entire history of that framework. Donald Trump also has inserted himself into the Nigerian security conversation towards the tail end of the year in a way that's actually forced Aso Rock to maybe not sit up fully or totally, but certainly take cognizance of the fact that the US is not just a disinterested bystander, but it's an interested bystander, even though some of the proposals on offer by the Americans may not structurally address the issue, but at least there is a reckoning that is beginning to happen, right, in Nigeria around that. Then the second development, apart from the return of Donald Trump to the White House, and yes, that happened in 2025. It feels like 2 years, right, since he's been president. But the second development, to my mind, would be the rise of populist movements in parts of the continent, which we may not necessarily say we're immune from populism, but they have certainly not had those kind of pressures for quite some time. So the protests, for example, in Kenya, the protest and the reckoning in the aftermath of the elections, right, in Cameroon, the continued terraforming of Sahelian West Africa, Mali, Niger, uh, Burkina Faso, right, in the light of their coups and the increase in the restiveness, particularly of young Africans in every major African economy, whether it's Kenya or Egypt, Nigeria, or South Africa, means that the conversation that started in 2022 and 2023 with particularly with the Nigerian elections around the importance and the relevance of democracy across the continent, especially since democracy has had a checkered record of delivering economic benefits for most Africans, has now reached a crescendo. And I think those two developments, and there are interaction points between those two developments, but I think those two developments have largely shaped and colored the issues and the events that we've been seeing on the continent. The third point that I would quickly make is Sudan and just how much of a catastrophe and a tragedy the ongoing not so civil war in Sudan, right, has been, and how even on the continent, let alone outside the continent, the the that conflict has essentially become the most silent, deadly, the most silent and certainly the most deadliest conflict that we can find anywhere in the world. And you can draw a straight line from Sudanese perspective. It's been blood, it's been gore, but it's also been the fact that geopolitical players, chiefly the United Arab Emirates and Turkey, have fueled a conflict which is beginning to spill over to other parts of and to other African countries, the Central African Republic and Chad primarily. And that particular issue may become even more of a live issue heading into 2026. 2026. I'll leave that for now. Or I'll stop there for now.
I mean, I do agree with you that, in this year, 2025, we woke up to kind of like a shift. And in the beginning of the year, where we saw the Trump administration, kind of cut down aid to Africa. And Samuel, I'll ask you this question. How did the return of, the hard America first, posture reshape Africa's geopolitical bargaining power in 2025? I mean, we saw a lot of, external pull, would I say, if I can put it that way, pull for Africa. I mean, it went from being diplomatic, and we've had like kind of coercive, if I might add. What did you think that all this, will I say, struggle for Africa and its resources, if I put it that way, anyway, reveal about Africa's capacity to also respond collectively to a crisis? Do you think we responded properly in some cases, or do you think we still have work to do in our unified response to also putting Africa first and building Africa for Africa or by Africa?
Yeah, I think that's it's actually complex. I'll call it a complex web of action, given the fact that we have about 54 different governments and to actually find, how will I call it now, to find a spot of negotiating among those 54 seems to have eluded us for generations. But that said, I think it's important to say that the dominant posture that we see coming out from the US, I mean, it's clear to all. It's about leverage first, and then other things follow. Essentially, engagement seems now to be conditional, right? It's very volatile. We have these volatile diplomacy systems rather than the predictable leadership or partnership concept that we've seen over the last, I would say, 30 years. But just to drill down a little bit, I mean, maybe to unpack this one by one, I think it's important to mention that the pressure that you see coming from the US is one thing to think about, but to also understand that they are also dominant players that are also pulling the string behind the curtain. For instance, you look at China's approach. For instance, China now announcing to the world that the whole concept of being classified as an LMIC will not apply, meaning that they're actually pushing the phrase up in terms of how they respond and then they interact with Africa. Whether we like it or not, the influence of Russia seems to be there. And then you see towards the tail end of the year, you see the breaking apart of the European Union and the United States. And you see, of course, you must have been seeing the interaction between the French, which is closer. I think that's the closest to Nigeria because, again, the United Kingdom is no longer part of the broader EU conversation. So you see the French actually getting closer and closer to Nigeria. And then, so you have different groups of people actually pulling on the string. But to your question, the American first engagement, I think it's a genuine concern, whether we like it or not. I mean, the US seems to be using pressure, more like the coercive nature, I mean, which is very strange because they're using explicit coercive signaling to actually shift the decision, especially when you see their interaction with Nigeria, you see it with South Africa, you see it with Ghana. You see it even with broader Africa when it comes to deporting people into Africa. I think that's the first point to note. The second thing to think about, especially from the Nigerian perspective, is that yes, Nigeria actually pushes into the value right framing fight. That's what Nigeria has always done, right? The Nigerian official have publicly, whether we like it or not, rejected the insinuation that the issues we have in Nigeria is actually state-backed, essentially framing it as more of a problem rather than a value thing, which is good to some respect in terms of when you approach it like that. But of course, we have some other people pulling things in Nigeria also to show the world the alternative view of that. But at least it's good that you have a more cohesive response from government to say, okay, this problem that you're seeing in Nigeria is not necessarily state backed, but rather more of a bigger problem, which is almost the same approach that South Africa also did. If you remember the conversation within the president of South Africa, or is the prime minister of South Africa, and then Donald Trump in the White House. And that was how it was framed. Almost the same, similar thing was done in Nigeria. Now, from the policy lens itself, pushing Nigeria into a transactional, I mean, Africa, so that I don't talk about Nigeria. I think the messaging is structured around compliance, incentives, and penalties. If you don't do this, we give you aid, sanctions, and then there are consequences, meaning that the US continue to see itself as actually having the power, the stick, and they can actually whip Africa into control. Not minding the fact that China seems to have more influence in Africa than even the US. I mean, we must say that. Why the global media will paint it as if the US are carry more influence. I think even in Nigeria, I think the influence of China seems to be more powerful. Um, I will say again, I think so that I don't draw this so long, the more you look at it, it's a complex way. But the conclusion here is very simple. Leverage first policy or American first policy that you see playing out, I don't think it will work. It may work in the interim, the short term, until everybody finds its own ground. But in the long term, sorry, it typically will fail. I mean, for me to say this, I know that the US historically, even when Trump was president the first time, had sent a lot of diplomats to Africa. I had spoken to some of them, and their perception has always been, what is China doing that they are gaining so much influence in Nigeria and Africa in particular versus what the US is doing and then trying to compare it. I think the disposition and the conclusion is simple. Using using sanctions and actually winning hands, trying to twist government into action has not worked. Unfortunately, the US seems to be trending that direction. I don't know for how long they will do that, but what that essentially means is that it's going to push most African countries, once they find their balance, towards other alternatives. And unfortunately for the US, the alternatives are becoming very weak. Just like I mentioned earlier, you have the European Union that is actually trying to be their own policy tool in their own core. You have the Chinese, which are very influential in Africa. There's no country in Africa that you step into that you don't see the Chinese influence already. Of course, we know certainly that Russia, if you look at what has happened in Mali, Burkina Faso, Russia is also, and then you look at the Horn of Africa, Russia's influence is there in terms of military well-being and all those kind of things. And so those are three strong body of people, I would say governments actually having significant influence in Africa. Not to mind the fact that the Asian tigers also, things like the old Asian tiger, you're talking about South Korea, you're looking at Japan themselves. If you listen to their policy disposition, they are beginning to take serious clue into what they can do to actually gain, to actually foster more influence in Africa. Whether we like it or not, by 2050, Africa will have the younger. Africa presently have, of course, significant population, but when you look at it by 2050, one in every five workers in Africa, I mean, one in every worker in the world will actually be an African. And that's something for the world to actually think about in how you begin to build relationship with Africa. I don't think the US approach in the long term will turn out to be good. I know, yeah, the president have a 4-year tenure. 1 year is already gone. He has 3 more years. But the damage that 3 years would have done could come back to actually haunt the US when everybody now gets on the playing field. I think that's how I'll conclude.
I mean, speaking on that, I mean, kind of your response takes us to what we also saw. I think you spoke a little bit about what's happening in Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger. We saw their breakup from the ECOWAS. Does their exit, I mean, of Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, did it mark a failure of ECOWAS or the failure of political order, which was meant to be protected? And do you think that this division would go on to have an effect on security and governance in 2026?
Okay, so yeah, will it have an effect going to 2026? It absolutely will. Uh the the AES, as they are called, um, have showed I wouldn't say an altogether surprising amount of resilience, but certainly many geopolitical watchers weren't expecting that all three military regimes in Niamey, Bamako, and Ouagadougou would still be standing more than a year after at least the latest of those authorities came into power. So there's a certain amount of resilience in Sahelian West Africa, which has become a rhetorical and a narrative weapon against the rest of ECOWAS. And ECOWAS has certainly not helped itself in the sense that it has stuck to what I consider outmoded and unfit for purpose communication and engagement strategies, right? The fundamental issue at play is that there is a crisis of legitimacy right across Western Central Africa, right? Leaders, I think, since the turn of the millennium, have never been as distrusted and considered untrustworthy as they are right now. And a lot of that mistrust is well earned. And so, in that sense, these three countries with still relatively unproven leaders and the wealth of challenges, right, in fairness, have nonetheless been able to mask their weaknesses, right, at home, in part because, they are French speaking, a fair amount of West Africa is English speaking, most Africans on social media are insular, they're more focused on their domestic issues and less on what's really going on, right, in other African countries, except to the extent that those developments affect or change the domestic picture in their home countries. And so in that sense, many people in Cote d'Ivoire and in Ghana and in Nigeria, and even in some of the other French-speaking West African countries, don't really have a sense of what's really going on the ground in these three countries. But what they do have is a wealth of narratives that are being peddled on social media, a lot of which is actually generated at the behest of Russian sponsored and Eastern European sponsored, but online a lot of which leverage artificial intelligence in the creation of videos or posts, or essentially manufactured events, right? And that's what a lot of people in coastal parts of West Africa are consuming, and it gives them this sense that those countries are actually more successful than their home countries, whereas that couldn't be further from the truth. So that yin and yang, both on the narrative but also on the geopolitical side of things. We saw the recent issue, for example, in Nigeria, when a Nigerian Air Force plane had to make a landing, I believe it was in Mali, right? And there was some confusion over whether it was an enforced landing due to mechanical and technical issues, which is the Nigerian position, or whether that jet was compelled to land coercively by Malian authorities, which appears to be the consensus, right, in certainly on Malian and Burkinabe social media. So that yin and yang will certainly continue in 2026 as long as that fracture, right, within ECOWAS remains and persists. Having said that, I have it on good authority that a lot of those three countries still back channel diplomatically and engage with Nigeria and other West African countries on important shared priorities. But that would never make the news. That would never be front and center on social media. And so that continued narrative tug and pull will continue to remain a feature. We believe in 2026.
Okay, so we also have active conflicts. I mean, we have the conflict in Sudan and DRC. Samuel, what do you think, is prolonging these wars, and what has this revealed about the limits, these wars, what have they revealed about the limits of Africa's conflict management? And what must change in 2026 and beyond to prevent these kind of crises from happening? Also, I'd like you to touch on, we also saw some Gen Z protests in 2025. Do you think that this reveals a turning point in Africans' politics? Um, what failures do you think are driving this? And do you think that we're going to see more Gen Z protests come out from other African countries in 2026?
Yeah, I mean, I always tell people that I'm not. They always say economics is actually they say a profession that gives astrology a respectability. So I would like to look at my gazing this thing. But I think let's look at. I think there are six defining themes that we need to pay close attention to, especially when you look at the insecurity and then the spillover effect of that in Africa as it were. I think the first thing is about governance and vacuum. Um, uh, I mean, you look at Mali, for instance. When you people look at Mali, they say, "Oh, Mali is doing well, ABCD, just like Burkina Faso is doing well." But if you go closely and you look closely at the number, let's look at Burkina Faso. That yeah, you see a whole lot of I will always call it a lot of propaganda being actually pushed on social media. If you look at the biggest taker of goods from Burkina Faso, their export potentials, it winds around Switzerland. Switzerland accounts for almost 60%, 56% in 2024 of virtually all their exports. After Switzerland, the next country, which is a conduit itself, because yeah, they're taking gold into those countries, is UAE, and they account for 26%. Then once you step out of UAE, the next countries that come into play is West Africa. You're talking about Ivory Coast, you're talking about Mali, you're talking about Ghana, you're talking about Togo. Then you limp into South Africa. And then you can now begin to look at other countries. They are not very good playing even with Nigeria. They've not been able to explore the market in Nigeria. And that is clear. Clearly, the problem that actually triggered the coup in the first place, meaning that there's a governance vacuum, enough resources to actually begin to address the challenges in the country is still there. And as such, things like ability of the state to actually mobilize resources, ability to build a military infrastructure that won't be used to actually usurp authorities and then democratic norms. It's still there. They are still fragmented across Africa. Even in Nigeria, if you look at the structure of the Nigerian military, it's sustainable and it's there. You look at the Nigerian police, for instance, you know what I'm talking about. So those things are still problems that you need to look at. That's the first thing. The second thing there is that you have this regional fragmentation, which, whether we like it or not, reduce coordination and capabilities itself. The international pressure that you see, because everywhere is fragmented now, just like we said earlier. Russia is pulling its string, China is pulling its, the US is pulling. So before you know it, everything falls into play. And we saw that already happening in Benin, where you see crisis happening I think we talked about it, the trade between Benin itself and then Niger, and then how that could have metamorphosed into a coup d'etat, if not for Nigeria, maybe France actually acting to stop what's going on. Then you look at the humanitarian collapse itself around multiple security risks that it brings. Things like famine, the USAID pulling out, and then the vacuum it has left, a lot of people actually falling into poverty. We need to address that. There's the international support, uh, whether we like it or not, to increase those conditional volatile spaces itself, and so that I don't go on and on and on. But overall, I think there's always a spillover of some of these things, and this is what creates militants and criminal that actually empowers criminal, and then I will call it militant networks that later translate into some of those issues like trafficking and then cascade into government failing. And so these themes are still very much with us, except we want to deceive ourselves. And as long as they remain, definitely, just like I mean, raising your question back, yes, Africa will most likely face some of these challenges, even in the new year, even by 2026. It's quite sad that that's where we are. I will conclude by saying that the Sahel problem is no longer a Sahel size problem. In 2026, we should continue to see those regional system failures and then the spillover of that, especially as Africa itself and then those regional blocs that had held sway for long begins to actually break apart. And it's sad that will one way or the other also lead to some humanitarian collapse. That is what we see. That's what I believe will happen, except something significant happen on the part of the United States and then maybe on the part of Russia and then on the part of China and the European Union to actually begin to stir this tide. But if you look at the budget, the movement of the far right across some of these countries, the trend shows, or even the UK is cutting down budget for humanitarian support. So if that be the case, definitely we'll have humanitarian collapse. And once we have humanitarian collapse, people will come into to fill in the vacuum. And of course, those that fill in the vacuum will come with guns, and then will come within their insecurity. I think I'll pause here.
So Samuel, I'll stick with you on this one because we're moving into economics. How do we explain Nigeria's improving macro indicators alongside worsening human security? What is broken in this growth model that we're experiencing now? And what policy trade-offs are governments making when stability on paper does not translate to safety on the ground?
Yes, that's a tough one. I think that's how will I call it? That's the we call it the economic transmission paradox itself. And so it goes that the theory that most economics, especially I'll call it traditional economic models, is built on is that if you fix certain things, for instance, you're rating on price, you make sure the price of goods and services are actually at the low point. Two, you ensure that your fiscal framework governing government spending does not create contingent risk, essentially does not create risk, especially for businesses, does not crowd out business or all those kind of things. Three, if your macroeconomic environment is stable enough to attract investment, investment will come in. And then four, once investment comes in and your tax system is not punitive enough to actually chase those investors away, definitely jobs will be created. And once jobs is created, by extension, the domestic ability of government to continue to actually mobilize resources improves, and then by extension, ABCD. So extension, extension, extension. When you look at the extension and the gravity at which we will go until you get to improvements in the income of the working poor, the have-nots, um, that's where the dilemma is. That's where the paradox is. Does macroeconomic improvement, does fiscal, those macro level information actually translate to meso level improvement? And does meso level improvement leads to actually micro level improvement that people can feel in their house, on their street, when they walk into the mall? I think that's the dilemma we have as a country. And then we've been trying to solve this since I think since 1960, since we became a country, and even since the central bank was established in the 70s. Um, to the question, to back to your question, I'm not convinced, to be sincere, about the direction of travel of Nigeria. I think Nigeria, one way or the other, yes, when you look at the numbers, the states in Nigeria, they seem to be awash with cash. Just for clarity, about 3 years ago, the income, the total federal collected revenue the federal government's share of collected revenue was just barely under 6 trillion, so about 5 point something trillion, if I recall very well. If you take out the accounting gymnastic that goes with it, it's about 5 point something trillion. Now we are doing over 21 trillion. That shows you how significant the revenue of the federal government had grown within the last 3 years. And it come at a cost. First, inflation, the price of goods and services had more than tripled. And then people are feeling the pinch. Of course, subsidies were dropped. The price of electricity, the price of food, the price of housing, the price of transportation, the price of clothing, they've all gone down. Essentially, we've pushed millions of people into poverty. Now, the big question is that how do you lift people out of poverty? Of course, if government can take some of the resources that they've collected and then begin to invest it in things that one way or the other will actually put the power in people's hand and actually begin to lift them out of poverty. But unfortunately, if you look at the trajectory of the framework of our spending framework in the last 2 years, it's been a disappointed to say the least. I mean, I can't say clearly whether those spending had any impactful shift in poverty in Nigeria. And that's why when you go on the street of Nigeria, you see poverty on everybody's face. That's to start with. The second thing I need to mention here is the macroeconomic indices itself. Yes, the Naira can be stable, but we have to remember where we're coming from. About 2 years ago, 3 years ago, 2 years ago, thereabout. The Naira was barely about, I think it was about, officially, we are doing like 600 thereabout. I mean, it's better for me to just edge and say 4 years ago. We're doing about 450, 500 uh, Naira to $1. Now we are above 1,000, right? Above 1,000, 1,005. A pound is around about 2,000. It shows clearly that a lot of things had happened within the space of 4 years. Of course, on the coffers of government, it looks as if things are settling down. But once you take away the pressure point itself that people are trying to cope with, then the next round of devaluation starts again. That's been the trajectory. That's been the story of Nigeria. And why is this going to happen? Because we continue to indulge in things we should not indulge in. Um, I'm not a big fan of saying that you should not import goods into the country as long as you're importing very good. In fact, Nigeria is near a state of austerity, meaning that we do very little trade. But that said, we need to ensure that the resources that we have is actually working for our people as in terms of bringing in equipment, in terms of what we call economics, we call them capital formalized, I mean, formations. Unfortunately, I don't think we are investing enough in housing. We are not investing enough in things that create assets, asset generating investment. Rather, we continue to push our spending into areas that have very, very limited impact on the working poor and they have not. So my conclusion, so that I don't keep talking about giving you an economic thesis here. The biggest challenge I have is that the household in Nigeria, about 40 million households in Nigeria, and that's the prism to which I will ideally judge economics. If you look at the 40 million household in Nigeria, can you tell me clearly that these macroeconomic indices that we're talking about had improved their way of life? That's one. Number two is the income of the household increasing faster than inflation. I don't think so. Inflation is still very near 15%. Income of people seems to be falling in real time. So that's the second big issue that we have. The third issue that we have is that the household getting healthier? I don't think so. If you look closely, we talked about the humanitarian crisis that the US withdrawal of aid had created. Essentially, most likely, and if you look at the last survey, you will notice that very, very few people are even giving birth in actually, I mean, most of our skilled birth attendants, they've gone. So in terms of even the health of the household, I'm talking about the real health, not even the financial health. It's weakened. You look at the education of household itself is also a problem. Are we giving people more skills? I don't think so. I don't think we are getting more skills to actually begin to ride over things. Are we getting more equipment to actually begin to boost our measures of productivity? How many tractors have farmers gotten this year? how many new machines and equipment had flowed into the country this year? What's happening to SMEs and all those kind of things? I don't think so. I don't think that's happening. In terms of home ownership, I don't think we've built enough house in Nigeria to begin to keep our people, the household itself. So my take here is simple and straightforward. I think a whole lot of work needs to be done beyond the rhetorics of macro level indicators. Macro level indicators in Nigeria suggest that things in the right direction, but we know that's where it bucks up. If we look at the trend of things since 1960, how do we begin to translate macro level improvement to meso level improvement and then to micro level improvement? I think that trickle down economics or the down hop models that we adopt will show that. Unfortunately, the trickle down economics that we've done in Nigeria over the years had failed us, and there's no suggestion that we are moving away from that model anytime soon. Now I sound like an economist. I want to go back to be my normal policy person.
I mean, if it helps our listeners to, understand the economics that's going on, macro and micro, it's important. Nkemese, over to you. SBM Intelligence always does kind of a focus report the year ahead, where it looks at predicting what will happen in the coming year. I know we had done a report for 2025. What were we able to predict in 2025 that came true? And it'll be good to hear our predictions and what the reports, kind of summed up for 2026.
What the report summed up for 2026 or 2025?
So I was trying to do like if we can do like what worked or what was our prediction,
Okay.
for 2025, and then what are we predicting to happen in 2026? If you can give us a tidbits, and our listeners would definitely have to go back to read the full report to get all the juice that we have put in place.
Oh, for sure. So just in terms of the top line for 2025, right? So we made 45 predictions. Do we actually call them? Yeah, we call them predictions. So we made 45 predictions, and 46 predictions, I should say, and we got 27 correct. So things like Togo's election returning Faure Gnassingbé into power, Gabon's referendum paving the way for the transition of Brice Ngema from being the military leader who overthrew a democratically elected government to being an elected president. We foresaw the coup attempt in Burkina Faso, which was ultimately unsuccessful. And also the developments in Ghana, where the new-ish administration of John Mahama, right, has gone on a prosecution spree of officials from the previous Nana Akufo administration. The renewed scrutiny of security in the country, especially the focus on the Office of National Security Advisor, the rise in the youth gang crisis in the country. Those were some of the things that we got correct. We said we also predicted the political and social furore that has greeted the implementation or the impending implementation of the tax reform bill, the rise in our external reserves, and the fact that the CBN would increase oversight, right? Regulatory oversight on fintechs broadly. Some of the things we didn't. I don't know if I want to talk about some of the things that we didn't get quite right. So we have a correct, partially correct, and wrong, right, matrix, and Like I said, we only got like 8 predictions wrong, 10 partially correct, and 27 correct, which is, in terms of broad year-to-year trends, that largely tracks with what the accuracy of our prediction model is for the year ahead. Some of the things that we think will happen in 2026, just some of the top lines. Obviously, you can get all the details when the report comes out. I believe as this podcast, right, comes out as well. The National Assembly is currently considering a bill to move presidential and gubernatorial elections to November of 2026, 6 months earlier than scheduled, so that basically the idea is that all litigation will be resolved before inauguration in May 2027. We don't think that bill will pass. We think that a new political coalition clustered around disaffected northern elements and opposition figures will solidify their structure in 2026 to challenge the APC in 2027, and that may involve some breakaways from the ruling APC because they can't keep everyone happy. We expect protests around the implementation of the new tax laws. Yeah, so people actually hitting the streets, and there are people that are already, sort of messaging this on social media and using the anti-tax protests anti-tax increase protests in Kenya from late last year into early this year as sort of an inspiration. We think GDP will grow around 4-5%. I think you alluded to that in your introduction. We think inflation will continue moderating. We think that the Naira will remain largely stable within sort of the current 1,470 to 1,520 to the US dollar band throughout the year. Oil prices will be softer next year. China's economy is not growing as fast. Non-OPEC supply, right, continues to flood the market. We think we would outperform our OPEC quota. And we think that there's going to be a round of mergers and acquisitions occurring in Nigeria's financial sector ahead of the banking recapitalization deadline, which is due in 2026. I think just as at the time that we recorded this, the CBN has revoked banking licenses for some minor homes and savings loans businesses. So that's already indicative of some of the the aggressive body language, which we think that the CBN will mirror. Unfortunately, banditry will remain an issue, kidnapping will remain an issue, pastoral conflict will remain an issue. And there's a climate change component to this, which we have decided to highlight, which is that this current dry season, so the 2025 into the 2026 dry season, we think will facilitate significant mobility in armed groups. We think that we're going to see the current spike in attacks on rural communities and highways in the Northwest will continue through early 2026. And just borrowing a leaf from what Samuel said, and it's almost as though Samuel spied on our report somewhat, because he basically called out these points in his analysis on what's going on in the wider Sahel. We also think that the security situation in the Sahel will continue to exert pressure not only on Nigeria but also on Ghana's borders. We're already seeing some of that flow-through effect happen in Togo and Benin as well. And so that expansion of the Sahelian security crisis, or that continued expansion into coastal West Africa, we think will ratchet up in 2026. And we think that we expect airstrikes by the American military, or American-supported airstrikes, even when they happen, right, or they are led by West African states. We expect those because of the greater American interest in Nigerian security, right, in northern Nigeria in 2026. That's maybe the spiciest prediction that we have for the year. you want to find out about the rest, and there are some more interesting things, then check out the report. Just as the podcast is coming out, and I'll leave it there for now, Veronica, just so that we don't give too much juice.
Yeah, we don't want to give up a lot because you know what, every report SBM puts out is amazing. And you need to read it to be able to understand the trends and curves of what's happening. I think I'd like to end with one question. I mean, just like one response from both of you. What will be, I mean, you can choose from either or. What do you think you would like 2026 to look like? And, what advice do you give African government or Nigeria, whichever one you choose, policy recommendations that can change the trajectory of this predictions, if I may say. I know that we have an election year for several African countries, as mentioned earlier, and we're also going to see a push for a lot of campaign going forward next year for Nigeria as well, ahead of our 2027 election. So one last word from both of you. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, from my own hand, I will say that the focus should be on cost of living. We're in a cost of living crisis. And then by extension, of course, the security, I'll call it the security compact for 2026. I think we need a single measurable program that ties, whether we like it or not, those micro decisions to actually visible household outcomes with I want most likely a quarterly public scorecard as we begin to move towards the election. So the first thing is, how do we translate inflation first into credibility? How do we have targeted relief, not just blanket subsidy? How do we make kidnapping financially impossible? How do we lock in gas to power wind first? Right, our gas utilization project, how do we translate that? And then we have the borderline security focus, especially around the Nigerian Benin border, those frontier. How do we translate that? How do we police that? I will end by saying that how do we protect our electoral trust early before the election season kicks in? I think those are the themes that I will look out for. In terms of policy recommendation, I think my policy recommendation will be wind around these six themes. So that I don't begin to rehash myself. I think our policies should actually wind around those six things. If we can fix those six things, definitely 2026 may become very pivotal in our drive towards building a more inclusive and then less divisive society. If we fail to do this, most likely, definitely we see escalation of those issues, and then we could potentially see, I think for the first time, a foreign government, whether it's by coercion or by agreement, actually entering into Nigeria, which we don't want to see.
Can I sit over to you?
I think Samuel's largely covered the field. I would say Nigerians should be geopolitically aware. I mean, the Nigerian policymakers should be more geopolitically aware. There's increased interest and scrutiny, albeit from a low bar in some of the actions, right, of the Nigerian government. And those domestic issues and international repercussions are beginning to enmesh and interplay in such a way that officials cannot just simply say, "Oh, this is a domestic issue. This is sovereign Nigeria. This is in Nigeria's sort of sovereign interest." And you could make this argument for a lot of other African countries. And so, just basically stay out of our way. The US primarily would be exacting a significant price if well, at least a significant price in Nigerian elite if more movement isn't done on important priorities around security, around health, education, the provision of social services, as well as the economy, which all have a security dimension to it in the grand scheme of things. So becoming more geopolitically savvy, becoming more geopolitically aware, I think would be especially in the choice of interlocutors, ambassadors, those who represent Nigeria's interests, right, in other countries. I think that would be very critical in 2026.
Thank you very much, Ikemesit and Samuel, for joining us on our final episode for the year. It's always a pleasure having you both on the podcast.
Yeah, thank you for having me, and Happy New Year. Happy New Year to everybody in advance. Merry Christmas and Happy New Year in advance. Just to repeat myself again.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me. Best wishes for the new year to everyone.
Thank you. To all our listeners, thank you for staying with us throughout 2025 and for making the week ahead part of your weekly routine. We are grateful for your time, your trust, and your continued engagement as we unpack the story shaping Africa in a rapid changing world. As we head into 2026, we look forward to bringing you deeper analysis, sharper insights, and clearer perspectives on the forces influencing our continent's future. This podcast is brought to you by SBM Intelligence. You can listen to us, all our episodes that we had this year, by searching for SBM Intelligence anywhere you find podcasts. For deeper insights into our work, such as our year ahead report, you can visit our website, sbmintel.com. And follow us on all our social media platforms, X, Facebook, Blue Sky, LinkedIn at SBM Intelligence. From all of us at the week ahead, thank you for listening and see you in 2026. Thank you.